ISIS. Do you carry on the campaign against ISIS with any changes? There have been suggestions from you in the last few months that there are things you would do differently. You'd call the planes back. What would you do?
It is extremely important that Canada continues to be part of the fight against ISIS. We need to make sure that we are part of the international efforts to degrade and stop these horrible terrorists. The best way to do that, however, is something in which I've fundamentally disagreed with Mr. Harper. I don't think that the planes are the right mission for Canada. I believe that, first of all, as we're seeing in Europe right now, that massive refugee and humanitarian crisis that's going on, Canada needs to step up much more in terms of refugees, accepting more into Canada. We've talked about 25,000.
How does that degrade ISIS?
Well, that actually...
I appreciate the refugee problem, but in
looks,
degrading, which you say you want to keep doing, how do you degrade ISIS without...
That's the third part of our thing.
Okay.
First are the refugees, because you recognize that if we're going to have any long-term stability in that region, we need to help people with the camps. We need to be supporting them there. We need humanitarian efforts that is going to continue to allow people to get through some of the very difficult times they're in right now. And we have to be part of training the local troops on the ground in order to carry the fight effectively against ISIS.
That hasn't worked for 10 years.
Well, you know what else hasn't worked is sending Western troops into actually doing the fighting for them. That's why we got into this mess, and George W. Bush's first.
So you don't have an answer on the degrading?
Well, absolutely. You make sure that the Kurds, for example, are able to fight to take back their territories. You work with them in a much greater way than we're doing right now, and not make things worse. And quite frankly, that's exactly where this government has failed.
The fight against ISIS, does it change dramatically and immediately if the NDP takes power?
Well, we've said clearly, and that's very much on the public record, that we will immediately stop the bombing mission and bring those troops home.
So all Canadian forces there, including those on training missions, would be brought home?
We will immediately withdraw our troops from Iraq and to the extent that they are doing some bombing in Syria and from Syria.
So we are out of the fight with ISIS if the NDP win?
Yes. Yes, no question about that.
You're comfortable with that position?
I'm profoundly in favor of that position.
Does ISIS pose a threat to Canada and Canadians?
Peter, I know it poses a threat to Canada and Canadians. It's continued war in a region that's known almost nothing but for 35 years. So I think that the best thing for Canada to do is to start playing a positive role for peace, and that would be a top priority for me as the Prime Minister of Canada.
I want to look at the broader international situation for a moment, and the ISIS situation specifically. Is the fight against ISIS winnable? And I ask that because more and more analysts and generals say this war will never be won solely from the air, that there has to be ground forces supplied by the countries involved, directly involved, the Iraqs, etc., as opposed to Western forces. But those countries don't seem to be able to fight on the ground. There's a question of willingness, a question of ability. This after more than a decade of being trained by countries, including ours. So is this a winnable war?
Well, in fairness, I don't think we have been involved in any military training in Iraq until just very recently.
Right.
And we are training a good fighting force in northern Iraq. And, you know, the Kurds and the people we're allied with there have been doing a very good job. It's a very solid force, and in the southern part of the country we have a different, obviously a different situation. But look, I think that analysis is all correct. To really defeat this opponent and roll them back, there's going to have to be a more effective ground force, and I don't think there's any desire or willingness for that to come from our countries. We've got to continue to do what we can to train people on the ground there in that country, in the region. And in the case of Syria particularly, there's obviously got to be a political solution that goes beyond the fighting. And the real problem in Syria, there's no one to support, or in our judgment, almost no one to support. You've got the Assad government, and you've got the jihadist extremists. I mean, these essentially are most of the fighters. So unless
there's no indication of any political solution to that.
Unless you can pull moderate elements out of both camps, you don't have a political solution. Well, look, Peter, this is a very messy situation. It's terrible. No, there's no instant solution. But what we do know is that we cannot just withdraw, allow ISIS to spread the way it was spreading a year ago, and use this as a staging area for international terrorist attacks against the world, including against us. That's
so are
why
we
it,
in for the
that's
long
why
haul
it
then?
remains important, even with the deficiency of the ground forces in the region, that we keep this organization on the defensive.
So we're in for the long haul?
We have to be in for the long haul. You know, I'm not hearing, you know, it's easy for the Liberals or NDP to say we can pull out Canadian forces, but I don't think our allies are going to say we could all pull out. That would be an absolute catastrophe, not just for the region. You know, not just adding tens of millions more refugees and displaced persons, like as we've been talking about the last few days, but it will present very quickly a radical escalation in the security threat to our own countries. We cannot tolerate it.